All right. Morning, everyone. Welcome to the most important lecture in the whole term. So I'm glad you're here. You should be glad you're here. Today we're releasing the second part of the assignment, and this is going to be at the heart of what you're going to be doing in that assignment. So what we're doing today is looking at two ways of doing equity valuations, looking at discounted cash flows and looking at residual income. Most of the lecture is going to be around discounted cash flows. So this is just putting this in context. Last time we saw each other, we were looking at how we can determine free cash flows to the firm and free cash flows to equity. And that was just after we saw how we forecast income statements and balance sheets, and that was following the analysis of historical financial statements. So this is only just one more step in that progression, and this is where all the building blocks come together to let us get an assessment of how much the firm or the equity stake in the firm is worth. So a few of the things we will be looking at today is we will look at cash flow valuation models, and that is something that you should be very comfortable after finishing this week's work. Understanding what's the different valuation techniques. They're all based on present value concepts. Apply the technique to estimate both the firm value of the firm and just the equity stake in the firm and the various scenarios. And you will see when we do this in the tutorial, we will be putting together a model, and that model, the main thing it has is that since all calculations are linked to each other, we can use the model to then do sensitivity analysis or work with different scenarios. So that is something that you will do on the practical side of things. The second part of this is talking about earnings-based valuation. So we've been pushing a lot to look at a firm's cash flows, but we will also look at an alternative valuation model using earnings today. So that's pretty much everything we're going to be covering. So the last point there you're supposed to get out of this week's work is to understand what to look for in order to identify valuation errors. So we have, once we build the model, we can do a few checks to make sure that the valuation we did makes sense and has no errors. So let's have a quick overview of we're doing valuation in which context. We're doing valuation in the context that our biggest underlying assumption is the value of any asset is based on the capacity that asset has to generate cash flows, right? So you buy a bond because you're getting interests out of those bonds. You buy a house as an investment because you're getting rent as a cash flow. You buy any firm because you're expecting cash flows to come from that asset. So the overall model we are working with is we are at all times doing a valuation in NOT, so we're doing a valuation today based on the expected future returns on any period frequency that we want to work with. We usually work with annual returns, and that discounted at an appropriate discount rate. Okay? So what this sum is defined between period 1, so that's the first period, and capital N. Capital N will be the end of the life of the asset. Right? So this is a generic overview. What we know is that when we're valuing a firm we usually value as a going concern. So that N tends to infinity, because what we assume is that the company will continue to exist, and it will not cease to exist at any point in time. So the valuation we can perform is at basically 2 levels. Firm level, the value of the entire firm, and at the equity level, in which case we only look at what's the value for shareholders. You're quick enough to know that the relationship between these two should be based on the level of debt, right? Whatever the firm is worth is going to be distributed mainly between, or entirely between, 2 stakeholders, debt holders and equity holders. So the difference between the value of equity and the value of the entire firm should be the value of debt. When you look at this, you can think at this relationship the same way you have a relationship between assets, liabilities, and equity. A similar relationship you should have between V as the value of the entire firm, the value of debt, and the value of equity. We have to do basically 3 things to value a firm. And this is, I hope this is clear for you too. For me, it's a very clear way of visually showing what a valuation is. And this is part of what we've been doing already. So when you're looking at the gray background part of the image, what we're looking at is at free cash flows for a number of periods, right? When we did forecasting, we called this period the explicit forecast period. So what we said is, when we're valuing a firm, we have to analyze the history of the firm and then look forward. And when we look forward, we'll have to forecast income statement and balance sheets and determine cash flows for a number of periods. That number of periods could be anything between 5 and 15 years. And it largely depends on how mature the firm is. Younger firms, you'll have to have a longer explicit period. Mature firms, you can have a shorter forecasting period. So what this is assuming is that we're forecasting the growth of the firm until it reaches a steady state. So that's the first part of this. And we are saying measuring expected future free cash flows. What we saw a fortnight ago is that those free cash flows can either be free cash flows to the firm and free cash flows to equity. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So then we need to use or estimate the free cash flow at the final period and use that to calculate what's known as the continuing value. And that is recognizing the value of the firm is a going concern. We will have to have a shortcut to calculate what happens with the value after the explicit forecast period. So we got our stream of cash flows during the explicit forecast period. Then we have our terminal value or continuing value. And finally, we need a discount rate that is appropriate to basically take each of these cash flows back to today, right? Because valuation is happening here, and we're having a cash flow here, a cash flow there, and so on and so forth. So we need a way of taking a present value. And what we're doing today, we've seen these things separately, but we are looking at which cash flow should go with which rate and what sort of value we will get when we mix those two together. Okay, so let's go to the first part, which is the explicit forecast period. This is basically what we did in our last lecture, which is determining the free cash flow to the firm and the free cash flow to equity. What we're doing here in these two columns is saying we have two potential valuations, valuing the whole firm and valuing equity. And what we are saying is we have two cash flows, free cash flow to the firm and free cash flow to equity, and we're putting each of those cash flows in the valuation that corresponds to them. So if we want to value the entire firm, we will have to use free cash flows for the firm, right? And one of the things we said about this is the cash flow from operations, and it is available for all debt and equity holders. And it's a theoretical cash flow in the sense that it is a cash flow, it is the cash flow the company would have if there was no debt, right? So what we are doing at the cash flow level is not paying any attention to what the debt structure is. We will take care of that when we incorporate the discount rate. But the cash flow level, this is a cash flow as if the firm had no debt whatsoever. Let's go to the second column and look at equity valuation. For equity valuation, we will use the free cash flow for equity holders only, right? Because the value of their stake is based on the free cash flows available to them after the firm pays all operating expenses and all financing expenses from debt holders. So this is including operations and debt financing activities. So this is basically working on what we did 2 weeks ago. Any questions on this? We can obviously, we know that once we value the entire firm, we can value equity. So we could potentially say that the free cash flow for the firm can also be used to value equity. But here I'm making a very clear distinction. If you just want to use the cash flows themselves, cash flow to the firm to value the firm, cash flow to equity to value the equity, I think it even makes sense with the wording we are using. Second part. So this is doing this bit here. The next part is looking at the continuing value. What happens after the end of the forecasting period? So what we do there is we use a shortcut. The shortcut we use is called a perpetuity, right? And you know the present value of a perpetuity with no growth is the value of the continuing cash flow divided by the rate, okay? And if there's growth, is cash flow times 1 plus the growth rate divided by the discount rate minus G, right? And that is what we're doing here. So what we are looking at here is at the continuing value or terminal value in period capital M for firm valuation. So for firm valuation, we should be using the cash flow to the firm. And I'm going a step ahead here because I'm already using a rate, a discount rate. And that discount rate is the weighted average cost of capital. Does it make sense that we are using WACC when we are discounting free cash flows to the firm? It must, right, because I put it in there. So at least I should believe that that's the case. But I think what's interesting to try and understand here, and these are the kind of things that when you understand you will never forget, is that when we're valuing the firm as a whole, we need to include operations, debt financing, and equity financing. So we need to include all three things, okay? Because we are valuing the entire firm. In our cash flows, we said we're ignoring the capital structure. So in our cash flows, we only have operations. Therefore, the discount rate we use for these free cash flows to the firm should incorporate both the cost of debt and the cost of equity. And that is what WACC does, right? We will see that in a second, but WACC basically incorporates cost of debt, cost of equity, tax savings, and the weight of each of those sources of financing. I will come back to that in 2 slides. But basically what we are saying here is continuing value will be based on a perpetuity using the first cash flow to the firm in the next period after the explicit forecasting period. So what we're doing is up to here, we got cash flows 1 to 7. Now we need to calculate the present value in 7 of all cash flows starting in year 8 and into infinity. What is that value? That's what the continuing value is doing. So this value here is the present value of all cash flows between the first cash flow after the end of the explicit forecast period and infinity. In money of what time? Of the end of the explicit forecast period. So in this example here, we are valuing that in money of year 7. We have 2 possible continuing values, one for the valuation of the firm using the free cash flow to the firm and WACC, and the other one using for equity, free cash flow to equity, and the expected return only by shareholders. Right? Again, same rationale. We have to include operations, debt, and equity. This cash flow here to equity has paid for all operating expenses and for all debt financing expenses. So the discount rate we are using is only showing the expected rate of return of equity holders. When we discussed forecasting and the length of the explicit forecasting period, we said we have to forecast for as long as it takes to get the company to something similar to a steady state. And the main reason for that becomes very clear when you look at the perpetuity formula. And that is the denominator in the continuing value formula is doing WACC, or the cost of equity, minus G. So the only way this formula makes economic sense is if what happens? What is the restriction we have in this calculation? How should growth be compared to the discount rate? Anyone? Anyone? What happens if growth is 15% and the weighted average cost of capital is 10%? We will get a negative value, right? Which makes no economic sense. Okay? So the restriction we have is that G, the growth rate, should be lower than the cost of capital, right? So you're usually told the explicit forecast period should be long enough so that you reach a long-run growth rate which is in line with the growth rates of the economy. So you're going to extend your explicit forecast period until you have an expected growth rate of 2 to 3.5%. So this is the second building block. We have a stream of cash flows for the explicit forecasting period. We have the continuing value. And the final, before I go in there, so the question is, how do we get this free cash flow for the period after the end of the explicit forecast period? Two ways. Number one is we just forecast income statement and balance sheet for one more year. Okay? And then we determine the cash flow derived from those financial statements. Or we use a shortcut, which is we use the last free cash flow and we multiply that times 1 plus the growth rate. Okay? So those are the two main ways of doing that. What you have to be very careful is that if you're doing both a valuation with free cash flow to the firm or free cash flow to equity, the growth rate for those two cash flows is not going to be the same. Okay? So using the shortcut could potentially lead you to errors if you don't adjust the growth rate. So a way to make it safe is to just estimate one additional year and use that as the base for your continuing value. What we're calculating here is the numerator in here, right? And we can do it in any of those two ways. The more detailed way to do it, a more precise way is the first one here, which is forecasting N+1 in full. Okay. So next week you will have a question on valuing, a short question on valuing a firm using information about free cash flows. Let's look at the third building block, which is the appropriate discount rate. So that discount rate should be in line with the cash flows we are using. So if we are calculating a valuation for equity shareholders, the required rate of return should be the return on equity capital. And let me go back 2 slides to show you what we're doing. 3. When we're looking at equity, we're using the expected return on equity. And when we are valuing the firm, we are using WACC, which is an average of the cost of equity and the cost of debt. So if we are calculating the value for all debt and equity stakeholders, value of the firm, you use the weighted average cost of capital. Because in any case, when you value any assets, what you're using is the stream of cash flows that you're generating for the owner / owners, and you have to use a discount rate that clearly contains the risks associated for those investors in holding the assets. Okay? So if you're looking at the entire firm, the average risk and the cost of capital related to that average risk is contained in WACC. If you're valuing only the equity stake, the average risk is based on equity. You got a question?
Yeah, I understand what's the point of doing free cash flow firm and equity, because if you're going to use WACC, isn't the information like implicit in the that you get in doing the free cash flow of equity implicit in the firm?
Yeah. So. Yeah, it's just 2 ways of valuing, and in reality, we are giving you 2 ways of doing the valuation, and you can go either way, right? And what we're going to see at the very end, and when we work the like in the training part of this, You're going to do it both ways. And the outcome should be that no matter which way you go, you're going to reach the same outcome, right? So in the end, you will end up choosing the best one for you. For instance, if you're valuing a firm from an LBO perspective, you'll probably ignore the current capital structure, use free cash flows to the firm, and then use in WACC your new capital structure after you take over the firm, right? But if you're valuing, if you're an analyst doing a research report for Amazon and you're doing that for potential investors, there are going to be small investors, you're going to be better off probably valuing the equity stake because that's what they're going to get. So the use you make of these tools will depend on what you're doing. Yeah. But you're entirely right. Like either way, we're going to get to the same point. So how do we choose the rate? If the historical rate is a good predictor, we can use historical rates. Otherwise, you will have to use some sort of adjustments into the future. For instance, if any of these conditions are expected to change, you will have to adjust discount rates accordingly. So what we'll do in 2 slides or 3 slides is see how we can make an adjustment when the capital structure changes. So main things that could change is the risk, overall risk of the firm, interest rates, and capital structure. Right? So those are the 3 building blocks of your discount rate. If those 3 building blocks are expected to remain unchanged, your historical rates can be used in the valuation. If they're expected to change, you'll have to make adjustments. Let's look at the weighted average cost of capital. This is the rate we will use to calculate the value of the firm by discounting free cash flows to the firm, right? So this is the appropriate discount rate for the firm because it contains both financing sources. Debt, which we need to do after tax, because if you remember when we calculate the free cash flow to the firm, we assume that is the cash flow of the company with no debt. So taxes paid in that cash flow have no tax benefits. Therefore, the discount rate we use to calculate the present value of those free cash flows to the firm has to have the tax savings. So we are using not the gross rate, but we are using the cost of debt net of tax costs. And the other component is equity. And we are only focusing here on common stock for this formula. If you had preferred stock, you would have one more term here using preferred stock. So how do we calculate weighted average cost of capital? Here we have 2 weights, the weight of debt and the weight of equity. Whenever you calculate a WACC, if there's 2 components or if there's 5 components, when you add these weights, they should add up to 100, right? Because 100, what you're saying is this is the average cost of capital for $1 of financing that this company gets, okay? So we got the 2 weights. Then we have the cost of debt, which you would have from the financial statements, or you could have a proxy of that by dividing interest expenses by total debt. And this is the after-tax cost of debt. So this is what this is assuming is, well, we know that if the company is paying interests, those interests can be deducted from tax payments. So the effective cost of debt is not this, but the after-tax cost. And finally, we have the cost of equity, which is the required rate of return for shareholders that we usually use CAPM as a way of measuring it, where we go, the expected rate of return by shareholders is the risk-free rate plus the market risk premium times beta, and beta there has a capital L, and the reason why we have that is because that beta is actually incorporating the degree of financial leverage the company has. And the reason why I'm stressing that here is because if I go back, we're talking about historical rate is good predictor if all these things remain the same. One of the things that may change is financial capital structure or financial leverage, and if that changes, that will have an impact on risks, right? What we know is if a company has more financial leverage, is that company is riskier for shareholders because the risk of default increases as the company takes on more debt. So that will have to be included in there. Let's look at an example of how we would adjust this. So if we have a company that has a new capital structure, what we will have to do is what we usually call unlevering and relevering, right? So we remove the financial leverage component of risk in beta of the old financial structure, and then we add back the risk component from the new financial leverage. Say this company, we measure their beta in the market and it's 0.9. That is the beta with the old leverage of the company. Tax rate is 35%, and the debt to equity ratio of that company in the past was 0.6, right? So for each dollar of equity, there's 60 cents of debt in the capital structure. The risk-free rate is 6%, the market risk premium is 7%, and now we know that when we are looking at the new capital structure of this firm, the debt-to-equity ratio is 1.4. So that means that for every dollar of equity, there's $1.4 in debt. So it's a considerable increase in debt financing, right? So what we know is that this will have an impact changing this value, and it's going to take it to a higher level. Hands up if you've seen this formula in the past. Yeah, 4 of you, a few more. Okay, so this formula for levering and unlevering beta comes from Modigliani and Miller's proposition 2 of capital structure and the impact first on the value of the firm and second on the cost of equity, right? And what it says is basically that there's a linear relationship between the level of financing, debt financing, and risks associated for shareholders. So what this says is there's a basic risk investors in a firm have to face, and that risk is when the company has no leverage. So this is the beta, the unlevered beta. So that risk is associated entirely with the operations of the firm, right? With how risky it is to do business in the industry and in the country and with the demographics the firm faces. On top of that, we know shareholders face additional risks. And that additional risk that shareholders face is financial leverage. Why is that? Well, basically because debt holders get paid before equity holders. And if there's not enough money to pay debt holders, all the money is going to go to pay them whatever we owe them. and shareholders will only get anything if there's money left after paying debt holders. So that makes equity holders face a higher risk, and that higher risk is based on the level of debt financing. So what we're saying is the total risk of a shareholder will depend on the operating risk plus the financial leverage risk, which is somehow reduced by the fact that interest payments for that debt can be deduced from tax payments. So there's a good side of leverage and a bad side of leverage. The good side is we get tax savings. Bad side is we increase our risk of bankruptcy. Right? And the theory of capital structure, of an optimal capital structure, works with those two things. Right? You want to get as much leverage as possible so that you reduce taxes that you're paying, but to a level that is acceptable for the firm generating capacity, cash flow generating capacity. So if we use this formula, we can unlever the 0.9 beta. So if we divide 0.9 by 1 plus 1 minus the tax rate times the old debt to equity ratio, we get that risk, systematic risk measured by beta for this company is 0.6. Does it make sense that this number is lower than 0.9? Yes, because the 0.9 has the operating risk plus the financial leverage risk. This one only has the operating risk. So first step, we delever or unlever beta. What we have to do next is, where we have 0.6, we have to get 1.4, because that's going to be the new capital structure moving forward. Okay? So now we relever beta by going, okay, so my base risk is 0.65. If I multiply that times 1 plus 1 minus the tax rate times my debt to equity ratio, I get the new levered beta for this company, which in this case is 1.24. And again, there's a positive slope to this function, so it makes sense that if we move to the right in the horizontal axis from a level of 0.6 beta to a 1.4 beta, it makes sense that the vertical axis moves up from 0.9 to 1.24. More financial risk, higher the beta. With this new beta, and we have the risk-free rate and the premium, the risk premium, we could calculate the expected rate of return for shareholders, which is going to be 6% risk-free rate plus 7% times 1.24. And what this is telling us is that based on our estimations of the historical risks associated with investing in this firm, I'm looking into the changes of leverage that the company will have in the future, we can expect shareholders to have a required rate of return of 14.68%. And this is the rate we would use to discount our free cash flows to equity to get the value of equity for those shareholders. Sorry, a question for next week. We can skip that. So summing up the whole DCF valuation model, we have two options. One is to calculate the value of equity straight away using our cash flows to equity. We call that E, value of equity, in today's money. That will be the sum of free cash flows to equity between period 1 and the end of the explicit financial period, in this case is 7, plus the continuing value discounted also at the risk, at the expected rate of return by shareholders. And I should have put that here, just make a note here, just to make it clear. This numerator in slide 14, going back now, is the bottom right formula in slide 6. Right? So this is what we had in slide 14, and this is how we calculate it. Just make that note, because that formula should have been there, just to make it clear that that's the whole calculation you have to do. And this guy here is going to be in the other valuation, but I'll show you that in a minute. So this formula incorporates all three elements: cash flows for the explicit forecast period, continuing value, because we are valuing the firm as a going concern, and the expected rate of return. Value of equity, cash flows to equity, expected return by equity holders. Those are the three building blocks for this valuation. Let's have a look at the valuation of the entire firm. So see, the structure is exactly the same. The only change is which cash flows and discount rates we use. Which cash flows do we use to value the entire firm? Free cash flows to the firm. What is the discount rate? WACC. And this comes from the bottom left part of that same continuing value slide. So just make that note. And this is how the whole calculation looks like. One thing, and I see this happening time and again, when you do your valuation, always your last cash flow, in this case cash flow 7, is discounted to the power of 7. And that is the same you use for your continuing value, right? Because your continuing value is the value in capital N of all cash flows from N+1 onwards. So both your last cash flow and the continuing value are based on that period there. Any questions so far? This is not explicitly put in there, but if we calculate the value of equity this way, and we calculate the value of the firm this way, if we've done a good job, we should be able to go to the financial statements, get the short-term and the long-term debt today, and if we subtract the value of debt from the value of the entire firm, we should be getting this same number here, right? I'll give you a brief when I get a piece of paper, I'm going to write that down for you. So the same way we have our assets equals liabilities plus equity. All right. What we've done when we rework our balance sheet, so this is accounting. This is rearranged, where we have net working capital plus property, plant and equipment, plus other assets. And on the right-hand side, we have short and long-term debt and equity. And finally, what we have is valuation, where what we have is the value of the entire firm should equal the value of equity plus the value of short and long-term debt. And these two guys here are the same, because there's no value creation in a debt instrument. The present value of a debt instrument is the present value of all the interest payments and principal repayments that you will do, right? So what this means here is that just comparing these two blocks here, and if we go, remember we call this capital invested. So if invested capital equals debt plus book value of equity, which is this guy here. If we compare this with our valuation, this comparison is key in understanding the difference between book values and our valuation. If we have an invested capital of 100, debt was 40, and the book value of equity was 60, if we value our firm using our free cash flows to the firm, WACC, and so on and so forth, and value is 150, we know that the book value and the market value of debt are the same. So what this is showing us is that whatever value is created at the firm level is passed on to shareholders. Right? And that's the nature of business, right? And that's the reason why you have debt instruments and equity instruments. So the $50 or 50 million that we say this company is creating, those 50 are all in the shareholders' pockets. So just to sum up what you're seeing there, we have three diagrams. The first one is the normal balance sheet in your accounting financial statements. The one in the middle is how we rearrange them, getting all the operations on the left-hand side and the financing on the right-hand side. And the final one is our valuation identity, showing the value of the entire firm and the value of equity. Those two we've been calculating today using discounted cash flows. Just a couple more things in discounted cash flow valuation. One is what happens with mid-year discounting. That is something sometimes it's used because when we do the discounted cash flow, we are assuming all cash flows are happening at the very end of the period. So some people like to use mid-year discounting to say, oh, instead of assuming that it's all happening on the last day, we're going to use it assuming that it happens halfway through the year, right? So that's a potential correction you can do, or refinement that you could use, where instead of discounting the first cash flow to the power of 1, you discount it to the power of 0.5. And then you go 1.5, 2.5, and so on and so forth. Yes? No, because you're still doing, that's a very good question. So for the first, no, you're still using your annual, you're still using your annual discount rate. Yeah. It's only that you're saying this is, we're using an annual rate, but we're only discounting it for 6 months, and then for 1.5 years and 2.5 years, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And a similar thing you can do when you readjust for any period of time. So this is just showing you that what we're doing with the whatever rate, we can do it with different powers for 129 days, 180, or whatever. Not much more. I think the main takeaway from this slide is if you want to make a refinement of assuming that cash flows happen more evenly throughout the year, this is one thing you can do. So a few advantages and disadvantages of the cash flow valuation method. Definitely advantages, you're focusing on cash flows, which is what matters, because that's what the company's owners will eventually get out of the firm. And that it gives you a good structure in terms of knowing where value is coming from. Is it coming from operations? What part is coming from operations? What part is coming from the financing side? Disadvantages, one that we're mentioning here is that the continuing value tends to dominate the total value. But the thing is, if you see that that's happening, if continuing value is taking a big part of the total value, that means you probably need to extend your explicit forecast period, right? At least so that you're comfortable that when you're calculating your continuing value, you have a steady state or a mature firm. And finally, this disadvantage, the projection or the forecasting of cash flows can be time-consuming. Reality is, in order to get the cash flows, you have to have the financial statements. So if you do a valuation based on earnings or based on cash flows, you would still have to do the forecast. And calculating the cash flows, it's not that much work. So I wouldn't put too much weight on that disadvantage. An exercise for next week or the following one. Okay, first symptoms of the day. It took a long time to get there. Is anyone here in Gemma's tutorial just after this? Yeah? I'll follow you to the room. Okay, 5 seconds. Do you agree with that?
There was a slide earlier that said full valuation doesn't include debt, and that equity valuation did.
Yeah. So basically, when you're doing free cash flow to equity and you're using, so your cash flows already have debt in there. Yeah. So this is a case in which when you prepare that question and you go, this is the right one, it was the wrong one. So, so the red is the right answer to this one. It's gonna make it unfair for the Tim Tams. Because I will still have to give the Tim Tams to whomever gets the most points. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Or I can give no Tim Tams for this one. And I eat them during the tutorials. Sorry, I just picked that one up. Do you agree with this one? Huh? Oh, don't be so hard. No, this was right. I was just trying to make you think it's wrong. Do you agree with this? When we calculate if we use free cash flow to the firm or debt and equity holders, we get the value of the entire company. So in order to calculate the value of debt, we need to subtract debt. So yeah, so this is from last week, right? When we use free cash flow to equity, we get free cash flow to the firm, and then the adjustments we make is the non-operating taxes, interest payments, and exchange of principal, either borrowings or repayments. Yeah. And it's add cash flow from new borrowings, because if we got new borrowings, that's a positive cash flow. Interesting. So whoever was in first there, they remain at the top. Yeah, the grammar in those options is a little bit iffy. But you got it. All right. We have one last question. There's an issue with the spacebar in this question. Yeah, that's one of the disadvantages that we mentioned. All right, so the winner of the most unfair quiz so far is, you're going to put your hand up? Yeah! Just make sure you've, if you took notes of that question, correct it. Well done. Okay, moving on to the next topic today. We've looked at valuation using cash flows. I would tell you, if you're left in the jungle and you have to take one tool with you, take cash flow valuation, right? So I'll make that very clear. But there's other ways of valuing firms, and we're going to look at one group of ways, which is using earnings for valuing a firm or the equity stake. So we will look at these things. We will look at practical advantages. I will give you lots of disadvantages. We're going to specifically look at residual income valuation. We're going to discuss the formula, look at 3 examples, and finally discuss some of the implied assumptions. So the whole point, supposedly, of doing earnings-based valuation is arguing that cash flow valuation requires much more work. I think that's a fallacy, that it doesn't require that much more work. But let's assume that that is the case. What you're doing is you're basing your valuation more on the financial statements as they are, instead of reshuffling things and making your own interpretation of the financial statements. Some of the issues that we may have is that all the effects of accounting policies and earnings management could potentially be affecting our valuation much more, right? So that is something to look into as disadvantages of this. So there may be some practical advantages, but there's also big potential problems if you're dealing with firms that have a tendency to manipulate earnings. So what's the whole idea of residual income? When we look at cash flows, in each single period, we are looking at the entire amount of cash generated for the firm, either to debt holders and equity holders, or only to equity holders. Is that a question over there? But I'm not like picking on you. Like, if you have a question, feel free to throw it in here. Pardon? Yeah, cool. No worries. Thank you. We're not that many, so we can interrupt. And yeah. So I was saying, when we're doing cash flow valuation, we're looking at the total amount of money generated by the firm, either to debt and equity holders or only to equity holders. When we're looking at residual income, what we're doing in each period is doing as if the company was repaying part of the required return to shareholders. So instead of looking at the whole amount of money, we're looking at the amount of money in excess from what the shareholders require. and we then do a present value of that. Let me give you the intuition. So what we're doing with residual income is we're valuing equity, right? With cash flows, we were either valuing the entire firm or equity. When we use residual income, we are valuing equity. And we're assuming that the value of the common shareholders' equity is equal to the sum of two things. The first one being the book value of common equity today, which you can see from the financial statements, plus the other part, which is the present value of all residual income. And by residual income, we mean income generated in excess of what shareholders expect. Okay? So the residual income is the amount which expected future is the amount by which the expected future earnings exceed the required earnings of shareholders. Let me get back to that in a minute. So we said two parts. Book value of equity. In our valuation of equity, we have the book value of equity today, plus, and just think about this as the explicit forecast period in our DCF. And this is our continuing value. Oops. Right? So these two bits here are similar to, and I'm going to move back to our cash flow valuation. See those two components? They're similar to these two guys here. Right? So that is valuation based on the present value of future profits. That could either be earnings or cash flows. So what's going to be different is how we define that expected return. Previously, we defined it as a cash flow. Here, we defined it as something minus something, right? The first something is net income, which is the bottom line in the income statement. And that net income, on an annual basis, is the accounting earnings generated by the firm for shareholders. And what we are doing in each period is we are subtracting something that is the product of two things. The book value last year and the expected rate of return. So what we are saying there is, let's assume book value is always 100, right? And the expected rate of return is 12%. What we're doing here is we're saying, if equity holders invested 100 mil and they expect a 12% annual return, they will be expecting to have every year 12 mil as an expected return, right? That is the minimum they would be happy with. 12% of 100 mil. That is 12 mil. We then have our net income. Say net income for this company was 20 million. What that means is that the residual income, and that is the income in excess of what shareholders expected, is 8 million. Okay? And that is the return we would use in our residual income valuation. We wouldn't use the expected 12 mil, we wouldn't use the 20, we would use the difference between those two, right? What is the assumption, the underlying assumption there? The underlying assumption is that the book value today is none other than the present value of the expected future returns. So this is 12 million in year one, discounted at the 12% rate for 1 year, plus 12 million in year two, discounted to the power of 2, and so on and so forth. So this is already capturing, the book value is already capturing what is expected. And this present value formula here is only valuing what the company is generating in excess of that. Questions? Okay. We're going to have 3 examples in a couple of slides, and I think it's going to make it a bit clearer. So we are down here, what we have is the calculation of the continuing value, which again is this same structure. The only difference is that we are multiplying the net income plus 1 plus G, times 1 plus G. So we're saying net income the next year minus the expected return. So this is the same formula we used for cash flows. Let's go through 3 examples, some simpler than others. Say a company has a book value of equity of 100,000, and investors expect to earn 14%. That means that the minimum they expect to stay happy is $14,000 per annum. If the company earns 13 per annum, that means that there is no abnormal earnings and that the residual income is 0, right? So what's happening in this situation is that, I'm going back to the previous slide, this is 14,000, this is 14,000. If that happens every year, this will be 0. The present value of 0 will be 0, and the value of equity will be the value of book value. Right? So that's the first example. So using residual income, value of equity will be the same as the book value of equity. Same company now starts earning 16,000 per year instead of 14. That means that residual income is $2,000 per year. So now the value of equity will be higher than 100,000. By how much? By the present value of 2,000 per annum, which in this case is 14,286. Okay? So if the company generates earnings in excess of the expected return, value of equity is higher than the book value of equity. Makes sense? I'm not going to take you through this one, but you can read it in your own time, and we will have questions similar to this in next week's tutorial. And we will also discuss what happens, because one big assumption we are using here is that all earnings are paid back as dividends. What we will do next week is show that, or how we calculate this when dividends are less than 100% of earnings. And very quickly, so these are steps, and we've gone through them. Main thing before we go is just making sure that if you do, for your second part of the assignment, if you use both a discounted cash flow and a residual income methods, your values should be the same or very close to each other. If they're too different, there has to be some sort of errors. And those errors could be that you are not having consistent estimates of the weighted average cost of capital, that you're not consistently managing cash flows and earnings, or that the computation of the continuing value has errors. So when you do, and if you do that with two different models, just make sure you make those checks. Just before we go, we have 3 short questions. So I don't want to take the Tim Tams back home. Five seconds. 4. Wow. Return on equity, which is, different way of estimating the same thing. So algebraically, the number can be negative. It would not make economic sense, but the calculation itself could be negative. Let's see who's the winner. Who's that? You are? All right, I'll give you the Tim Tams in a second. Thank you very much. I'll see you next Friday for the drop-in. Hi there.